we're on Mohawk. This is Mohawk territory.
No, this is Haudenosaunee territory.
Haudenosaunee.
Haudenosaunee.
Oh. Let's look at this. Yeah, this is the Compradores. Yes. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's there. Which includes Mohawks, United, Plantations, Creators,
Oh, we're on. I was trying to coordinate the maps of the territories as cars. It's not exciting. I didn't find the maps at all, too. We are to, yeah. It's the same thing we can tell us next part of the position.
yeah, especially because it's like a day, so that's fun. I was thinking, how you can be a little bit. I mean, it's not going to be as but I don't know if you wanted to, because what we could do is I could ride with you, and then Jackson could bring me back up to pick up my car later. So we and that way we can.
Okay, that's all.
That'd be good.
So do we make any decisions? Oh, I just talked to Louise, and I told her I'm coming back to halftime. And I kind of like it to be rather than maybe for a while when I do all sorts of stuff here. And that gives me time to kind of have access to other resources and to constantly. She was trying to get me to teach social awareness. And she volunteered to take it. At first I said no, but I thought about it. Because she's always so good to people. She's exhausting. So I think I sent her, I left her a hard copy letter saying I would do that, teaching social industry in the fall, stay for a year, to make sure she was okay. It was 1 year. And then just teach classes in the fall.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Thanks for coming.
I'm very glad to be here. I'm super interested, and I'm going to sit in the back so I can eat a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
So the city children Trisha wants to talk a little bit more too. She said she's going to start as really fantastic. Yeah, you know, she just it's just the beginning and we needed to lift up a bit. Introduction started and she had her speak with I mean, we're not supposed to talk about it. It was really enlightening to see that like, most of us are sort of newer, like first, yeah, he was the first generation that's currently there, and I call him mom. This is I'll do that going on for years. It's astounding. Their entire career shaped by this thing. So what are you, is this series?
Okay, so I'm making so we have some time. So good evening, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started with some introductions. Can everybody hear me okay on the virtual? Okay, I think it's okay. And then we're good in here, okay? So I'm Dr. Maria Chavez-Daza. I work in the African Latino Studies Department. And I am really happy to be here tonight to introduce Dr. Candela. Just a couple of announcements before we get started. If anybody is interested in lead credit, please sign in with me. And then also, we do have an event next week, which is actually the closing to our celebration of Latinx heritage, which is a salsa workshop that will be held in the Great Room in Lee Hall. So there will be a short presentation at the beginning, which will talk a little bit about the cultural significance of salsa within Latin America and some of the meaning behind some of the moves that we still practice today. And then there will be an actual workshop to learn how to dance salsa. So I hope that if you're interested in any of that, you will join us. The flyer is on our Instagram page, which is, our handle is ONI ALS Department. And there will also be flyers on campus. And I think that is it for my announcement. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight. Let's pull it up. So Dr. Ana Candela is a historian of modern China and assistant professor of sociology at Binghamton University, and we're so happy you're here. Thank you for joining us. Her research focuses on Chinese migrations to Latin America and on the global dimensions of Chinese history and China's social transformations. She teaches courses in post-socialist China, gender and Chinese society, Chinese migrations, the Pacific, and nationalism. She is a recipient of several distinguished awards, including the National Endowment of the Humanities Fellowship and a Ching Kuo Foundation Scholar Grant. She is currently a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in her most recent work was published in Critical Asian Studies in the Journal of World Systems Research. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Candela.
Thank you. This is a little bit bizarre in these pandemic times, so I understand there are people online and there will be people watching later, so I'll try to also give a good performance here. Thank you all for having me. I want to first begin by recognizing that I'm here as a visitor on Haudenosaunee land on occupied territory. And I want to thank Professor Maria Chavez, for inviting me today as a guest speaker in the Latinx Heritage Month Speaker Series. Also, Ann Winchester, who I understand is not able to be here today, for making the arrangements to bring me here. And then Africana and Latinx Studies, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, and the Center for Racial Justice and Inclusive Excellence here at SUNY Oneonta for organizing and hosting this speaker series. So my talk today is entitled From Compradores to Hacendados, Cantonese Merchants in Peru and the Expanding Settler Colonial Frontiers of the Cantonese Pacific, which is a bit of a mouthful. Okay, So it comes from a larger book project that I'm working on called Peruvian Chinese between Native Place, Intimate Others, Peruvian Chinese between Native Place, Nation, and World. And this is a book project that examines a series of print capitalist projects, so like newspapers, magazines, things that circulate broadly, history books, also community albums, merchant albums, and then look at them to see how Cantonese or people, Chinese people who sort of moved to Peru and then moved back and forth across the Pacific regularly, establish connections between their native places in Guangdong province of South China, and also to their places of arrival and their nation of arrival in Peru, to look at how they position themselves in local, translocal, transnational, regional, interregional, and global perspectives. And so they crafted a lot of different imaginaries. We tend to think of imaginaries in terms of positioning, in terms of nation states, but they actually juggled a whole lot of spaces in the way they position themselves in the world. So I look at that and try to understand how their arrival, the merchants that I'm talking about and I'll be discussing today, from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, sort of position themselves within a global settler colonial moment. You guys know, have a sense of what settler colonialism is? Okay, great, so I don't need to explain that too much. All right, so it's a kind of newer approach to study of Asians in the Americas to make that connection, since the Americas, particularly North America, are such very strong settler colonial societies. And so I'm trying to insert myself into that conversation with other scholars, and I'll say something about that in just a moment. Okay, so let me begin the story here by sort of taking us back into the early 20th century, into a fountain project that Peruvian Chinese elites kind of coordinated, funded, and built and contributed to the city of Lima. This is a project that in 1921 was part of the commemoration of the centennial anniversary of Peruvian independence. At that time, the China legation in Lima and other prominent members of the Chinese community across Peru raised funds to commission a marble fountain from Italy for Lima's part of the exposition. The arrival of the fountain in 1924 occasioned an inaugural ceremony and the publication of the album of the Chinese colony in Peru, which commemorated the success of the Chinese community and its contributions to Peru's national development by featuring the colony's commercial and agricultural elite. So we'll be looking at that album closely later in the talk. The fountain offered an allegory of the album's narrative in material form. At the top of the fountain, a group of racialized figures depicted nature lavishing her protection upon the races, portraying a scene of racial hierarchy and uplift that invoked the production of nature through the practice of agriculture as a civilizing process. At the base of the fountain, the figures of a man and woman, each accompanied by a child, so they're sort of right over here, poured water from the respective jugs into the fountain's basin, signaling that the rice and silk of the Yangtze Valley had arrived at the banks of the Amazon River, and the coffee and sugar of Chanchanayo Valley have arrived at the ports of the Huanghe River. In commissioning and inaugurating the fountain and the album, Chinese elites in Peru crafted an image of the Chinese colony that situated the community within the Peruvian state's mode of production during the aristocratic republic of 1884 through 1930. Towards these ends, the fountain communicated a message that associated national and racial progress with the harnessing and distribution of nature's bounty through the circulation of raw materials and commodities within national and global markets. And yet, when we read it critically, the fountain also conveyed messages about power and domination. It communicated messages about racial, spatial, and class hierarchies, namely of the domination of the educated, civilized, urban, Creole, and Asian immigrant elite over the backwards, rural, and laboring peasant mestizos, Indian colonos, and by extension, even the former black slaves and Chinese coolies who had once labored in large numbers on Peruvian sugar and cotton plantations. And if you look at this figure here, There's the hand-holding gesture of sort of the European sort of style immigrant lifting up what is a clearly racialized figure, and it's hard to tell if this person is Black, Indigenous, or a coolie worker, but it's sort of like an amalgamation of ethnic characteristics. And over here on this side, this figure of a woman sort of represents an Asian immigrant presence, so she has slightly Asianized features, or supposed to. The fountain conveyed messages also about the universality of these racial and spatial hierarchies as the fault lines of power, progress, civilization, and development across the world during the early 20th century. Thus, in commissioning the fountain, the elite of the Chinese community in Peru sought to position themselves towards the top of this hierarchy within Peruvian nation, but also within capitalism's global and racialized divisions of labor, by positioning the Chinese and Peruvian nations towards the top. All right, so let me pause before I continue the story. How many of you know about the history of the coolie Chinese migration to Peru? One person, okay. A lot of times people, when I start to talk about Chinese in Peru, there's two sort of responses, like, wow, I didn't know that that had happened. Or others who kind of knew think, okay, yeah, there was that president, Fujimori from Japan, who ran Peru, right? So those are two kind of responses. So let me just give you a little bit of history, because I know this is sort of new for some of you. So Chinese began migrating to Peru in 1847, and at the same time they started to migrate to Cuba in large numbers. And the reason that they went was because slavery was coming to an end. The slave trade was abolished across the Atlantic world in 1807, and so by the 1830s and 1840s, start to get a sort of preoccupation within Peru and also Cuba and in the Caribbean as well about the need for labor forces, cheap exploitable labor forces, to start to replace some of these workers who were sort of dying off or for the most part, like losing labor, the slave labor force on the plantations. And so a variety of solutions sort of start to appear, and one of the most dominant solutions was to look for contracted coolie labor. And so they went to planters from Peru and people who also were involved in the guano mining trade, which was a fertilizer mining enterprise, went to China and brought the first boatload of people over in 1847, and then after that found a viable alternative through this coolie labor trade. So in total, we can see that the largest numbers left from Macau, which was a Portuguese territory, and also other ports along the East China coast, including Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is significant because the British were there after 1850, that became a British colony. And they had a British trade in the coolie trade that went specifically more to the British-controlled Caribbean, and they had more sort of control and regulation of the trade. But the trade coming out of Macau, which was run with a lot of illegal kidnapping, people being sold into indenture, people being tricked into believing they were going to San Francisco and then finding out that they were actually going to be put on these plantations in Cuba or Peru. And most of them went to Cuba and Peru. But also there were some other countries, particularly in the Caribbean, receiving people as well in smaller numbers.
Could you tell us why this particular population is called that?
So coolie is a term from India. Here's the distribution of the ships going out by years. But coolie is actually a term that comes from India. And it being sort of, when it was translated over into Chinese, because this kind of labor regime was actually first initiated in the British Empire with the bringing over of indentured workers, indentured migrants to the Caribbean. And this is a much bigger trade. So we see 1.4 million people coming over as indentured Indian coolie laborers, mostly going to out the Indian Ocean and into the Caribbean colonies of the British Empire. And so the coolie labor trade to China was simply kind of a reconfiguration or an extension of these very same logics, where people were brought under contract and the contract was about 5 to 7 years, depending on the time when you contracted. And so it was considered to be free migration, voluntary migration, because you signed on the dotted line. But most people didn't know what they were signing. They were illiterate. They didn't understand what was awaiting them on the other side. And particularly in Peru and Cuba, what awaited them on the other side was basically a system of slavery. They were put in the exact same working conditions as black slaves. It was not considered slavery because it was not chattel slavery. They were kept in slavery for the entirety of their lives, and their children and descendants would not be considered slaves. But they were in conditions, working and living conditions of slavery for 5 to 7 years. And oftentimes they had to recontract. So they might recontract over and over again because they left really impoverished and had no way to escape the cycle. So it's a very kind of a sort of vicious labor system as well, a highly exploitative labor system. But the term comes from India. And then there's a nice translation into Chinese called kuli, bitter labor, so hard labor. The term is popular throughout South China as well for just people who do laboring people who hire themselves out along the coastal areas as well. Okay, so now the numbers of people who left, for the largest numbers went to Cuba, where there was about 150,000 people that went, and then to the second largest numbers were to Peru, where almost 100,000 people went. So it's not as significant as the coolie labor trade in the Indian Empire, but it's still an important dimension of these Trans-Pacific connections. So where they come from is all Guangdong province in the south. This is a Cantonese area, and particularly immigrant districts of South China. This is sort of, to get our bearings, Hong Kong, and Macau is over here. And most of the immigrant villages, these are different dialect groups within it, different Cantonese dialect groups. Most of the migrants are coming from these areas. And these areas are historically immigrant districts where people have been emigrating out for hundreds of years, but particularly to South China. And with the establishment of Hong Kong and the opening of TransPacific steamship routes from Hong Kong to San Francisco and then down the coast of the Americas, Chinese start to emigrate in large numbers and mass numbers for the first time, going up to Canada, North America, and down across the coast of South America. And it makes this trade even more possible, the coolie labor trade, as part of the extensions of these Trans-Pacific networks. Yes?
I have a quick question of the diagram. So the coolie trade labor, I hope I said that right. Did this take place in a time when all the continents, so like they were like, you know how every continent was like close next to each other, like in the world?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Is this like when that happened, or is this like
No.
far after when it was already separated and everybody?
This is after when everything is already separated, and so we need steamships to kind of move across the Pacific. Yeah, so remember how the slave trade had these like cargo passage, these ships that were people were really packed in there very tightly? Yeah, so this is sort of tries to reproduce that kind of logic because they have to go, it takes them like 3 months to cross the Pacific at this point, and there's, you know, there's high death rates and stuff, so it's actually a long distance trade at that point. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now where do they go? They end up going mostly to the coastal plantation areas to work on there's some islands off the coast where they do the harvest of guano, which is the bird droppings that is a very potent source of fertilizer in this period, traded and desired across the world at very high prices. But most of them will go up into the plantation areas, sugar and plum plantation, moving from Lima up the coast. All of those sort of coastal departments have major sugar and plum plantations. And then some of them will also make their way to Ica and Arequipa, where there's also populations of Chinese, but the densest concentration is northward. And from there, they start to move out afterwards as they leave the plantations. Some of them take flight and refuge, and then move out, and others I'll talk about once they finish their indentures will start to nest into local communities or trade chances to sort of become merchants and establish sort of commercial networks into the interior spaces. All right, so now, I want to put this history within a settler colonial context and talk about the Cantonese Pacific as part of a sort of settler colonial world. It's a diasporic, translocal migrant world that brought together the spaces in South China that migrants lived in and came from, and then the spaces within the Americas and then across the Pacific where they emigrated to. And this is a world that, because we're used to thinking in terms of nation states and boundaries and borders, this is a world that doesn't have maps, but it's a world that was created through the networks and the movements of migrants across the world and the connections that they maintained across the Pacific to their native places. And the reason that we should consider it a migrant world in and of itself is because a lot of these migrants, when they leave South China, which has a very long history of migration, has patterns of social living and modes of living based on migration, so that movement abroad is not necessarily always for settlement in another nation. It's for work and opportunity, and then coming back to the native place, establishing a family there. Maybe you leave again once you've established your family, work, continue making money, send it back. So there's a movement back and forth, and ultimately the desire is to return back to the native place. And people also re-migrate within these networks. But if it doesn't work out where in the first place they go to, they tap these migration networks and move to other places. So there's also a lot of mobility within this world. So it's a world that's continuously in motion. We're used to thinking in terms of settlement, but migrant diasporic worlds beforehand were really worlds that were quite fluid. And this was very natural before the closing of borders and racialized exclusions. Okay, so settler colonialism, since you guys are familiar with it, is the movement of settlers in. And as scholars have to remind us that the main things that kind of drive settler colonialism, it has a logic of two things. First is the dispossession of indigenous land. And secondly, it's the elimination of native peoples. So either through genocidal practices or events, or through sort of whitening practices, racial mixing practices to eliminate the native from the indigenous body, or through sort of the visual elimination, not talking about them, not writing about them, the narrative elimination, and pretending as if they don't exist, like the idea of the discovery of the Americas, as if Europeans were the first people to encounter the continent, is a narrative of elimination that assumes indigenous people aren't already there. So within the scholarship that is now starting to look at these histories of Asian migrants in Americas with a settler colonial framework, they're starting to think about complex questions about how there's also an Asian frontier of settlers and migrants coming in and moving across the Americas. At the same time that there is a white settler frontier moving westward, there's the Asian frontier moving eastward. And at the same time, we're starting to think, like Lisa Lowe urges us to think about the complex racial interconnections and interactions, or what she calls intimacies, that form the communities and the connections between these people and the encounters between these people. And as Jonathan Okamura and Candice Fujikani tell us, it's also important to think about the complicities that Asian migrants have with settler colonial processes. Even if sometimes they're victims of racialized exclusion through those processes, they are also beneficiaries. So they often tend to occupy very complicated situations. So my work sort of brings together these scholars who think about this in these ways. And Henry Hughes, the person I most build on, because he actually uses the concept of Cantonese Pacific to talk about how this migrant world is continuously sort of expanding and shrinking based on the rhythms and getting reconfigured based on the rhythms, creating new routes based on these sort of expanding opportunities and then the collapsing of those opportunities because of racial exclusion acts. So he positions this within the logics of an expanding white settler colonial world. All right, so what is happening in Peru? And why tell this story through a settler colonial lens? So settler colonialism, because it was a global sort of moment, and the 19th century, where you have the U.S. sort of really expanding as a nation state through settler colonialism, also Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And they become these sort of dynamic, particularly the United States, become this sort of very dynamic nation. The whole world is starting to look at settler colonialism as a viable project for nation making. And so this also happens at the end of the 19th century in Latin American nations, where they've already become independent in the 1820s, but they haven't fully integrated, they haven't moved forward towards, very robust national development, and they're starting to try to figure out, well, how do we do this? And Peru has a war that ends in the 1840s, the Pacific War. It lasts a few years, but it leaves the economy really devastated. And so they're trying to think about, how do we rebuild the nation and move forward? A group of liberal elites come to power who start to draw on ideas floating around settler colonialism, particularly the ideas of this gentleman, Juan Bautista Derdi, who was a sort of political theorist from Argentina. And he came up with the idea that to govern is to populate. And in particular, in order to make Latin America sort of a very robust, flourishing region of the world, one of the best strategies that the nations and governments could use is to sort of bring in settler colonists, bring in Europeans, particularly Northern Europeans, who are considered the whitest, most robust and productive nations and peoples of the world, to sort of create settler colonial projects across the territories. So some of this land that's not in production can be put into production and make these robust economies. So Argentina had really a lot of settler colonial projects. So in Peru, the liberal elites are like, okay, yes, we can do that. But they carved out a lot of little projects to bring in European immigrants, but it wasn't very successful because the conditions in Peru were different than Argentina. There were the Andean highlands, there was the Amazon. These are not very easily habitable places in which to practice agriculture. There was also a poor infrastructure. There was lack of irrigation, there was lack of roads and communication. So European immigrants who did come in with these schemes ended up not doing very well and not wanting to continue. So it was not a successful venture. So the elite in Peru start to think about, well, where else can we go? Who else can we look for? And they look to India, and they see that there are all these people there who are also, it's an overpopulated territory. So they think, okay, maybe Indians. But then they realize, well, then we'll compete with the British. So maybe we better not push that, arouse that, start to create a problem for ourselves with the British Empire. So then they say, okay, well, how about Vietnam or East Asia? And they think to China again. And they didn't want coolies anymore. The coolie labor trade had come to an end in 1874. It had been so exploitative that coolies started to rebel regularly on their plantations. Some of them, because they were kidnapped people on the streets, were literate people. They started to write petitions. They had histories of having had secret society organizations in South China. Some of those organizations and members of them ended up through the coolie labor trade in the plantations. So they naturally already had the mechanisms by which to organize. They start to write petitions to the Qing dynasty. Eventually these petitions get over there. And the reports also in the international press of the horrific conditions forced the Qing Empire to send a commission to Cuba and Peru in 1874, where a huge report was produced, the Cuba Commission report, documented in detail, and you can read it because it's been translated to English, all the abuses on these plantations. They didn't quite make it to Peru because there was a war that broke out there, so they made it by 1886. And then did a similar report over there. But by that point, the Qing dynasty had already negotiated an end to the coolie labor trade. They were just more concerned about the people who were still working out their contracts on the plantations. So Peru then, in the late 19th century, when it starts to think about bringing Chinese again, they can't do the coolie contract trade anymore. That's over. And they don't want Chinese population because there's growing anti-Asian sentiments there. But they rationalized that maybe this will be a good idea because they look to North America, the US in particular, and see these new migrants coming in who are coming in through the credit ticket system to the United States, where they purchase their passage and then pay them off as they work, but it's not a coolie labor condition. and they are kind of considered free migrants, and these guys have like big commercial enterprises in San Francisco, and they're considered to be much better than the coolies. So they think maybe we can adopt this same system over here. Now, it doesn't happen, which is not so important as much as the way these imaginaries create space for new immigrants to come. And what happens is instead free Chinese merchants come. The first one to come was actually a member of that commission that came in the 1880s to assess conditions of coolies or former coolies in the plantation areas. And he realizes that there's a great opportunity there. There's all these former coolies who have been starting to leave the plantations, settle into these communities across the local coast, and you can actually create tremendous businesses just by providing them with their needs because they don't have access to goods from China, which of course they will want. So one of them comes back and establishes a transnational commercial firm with ties to Hong Kong, to San Francisco, and ultimately later to other areas. And others start to follow suit. And these important transnational commercial firms get established in the late 1880s. And then they flourish all the way into the 1930s. So here we see in this early album from the 20th century featuring the most prominent Peruvian elites, or the elites in Peru, because they're not all Peruvian. A lot of them are German and British and Italian. It's an era when the opportunity to rebuild Peru after this war of the Pacific creates a lot of commercial and business opportunities in Peru, so people are flooding in. We see that Cesario Chinfuxan from the firm Wing Chong and Aurelio Pasanja of Paolo and Company. These are transnational commercial firms with big firms in Hong Kong, are featured as part of some of the most powerful commercial elite in Peru. And this is an album that very much adopts the kind of a settler colonial logic as the framework for positioning Lima as sort of the hub that links the sort of agricultural production of raw materials. Then it's the hub that sort of becomes the export site through Callao, which is the coastal town right next to it, to the rest of the world. So these guys are positioned there as part of that. Is that part of that transnational contribution to the development of commerce? So when the Chinese community, the Cantonese elite, who are mostly, they're all from Guangdong province, as I showed you, and specifically from Zhongshan County, which is that county where Macau is sort of located on the coast, then produce an album for themselves. They put themselves into the very same narrative, into a settler colonial narrative. It's not just a transnational commercial narrative, it's also settler colonial, and I'll show you what that looks like here. So this is, they feature themselves in a variety of ways. So in the album, they of course at the beginning promote their businesses. So they feature themselves inside of their modern businesses. This is Aurelio Pasanja, the guy who was part of that commission report and is considered the grandfather of the Chinese community in Peru, in his commercial firm with his son-in-law, I believe. You see a very modern, very well organized, very clean, orderly establishment there, a sort of hallmark feature of the era. But they also feature other things. They feature a lot of advertisements. And one of the things that you notice about advertisements is like there's all of these firms and banking firms. There's also TransPacific shipping lines. There's railroads. They're sort of putting themselves in relationship to the expanding infrastructures of capitalism that are sort of moving in and helping to open up and integrate the interior of Peru by building railroads, connecting telegraph lines, bringing in transnational banks that will facilitate transnational financial transactions. Shipping lines, this shipping line was established by these Chinese commercial elites that allowed, it was an attempt to create a shipping line that would go directly from Lima down the southern coast of Latin America, across the southern part of the Pacific, over to Southeast Asia, where there are lots of overseas Chinese communities and Cantonese communities in particular, and move back up to South China to get them back into their networks, rather than have to go north across to San Francisco and across the northern part of the Pacific. This bank here, which is a German bank, if you read these announcements in Chinese, what they're saying is something that they don't need to say in Spanish, which is we actually have dedicated personnel who speak Cantonese, or they speak Chinese, but it means Cantonese, who will help you do transactions across back to China, because people are sending money to pay for the goods from being sourced from the transnational firms in Hong Kong, and to send remittances back to their families. So this is an important service that they provide because they're based in Hong Kong as well. And all of these firms somehow have connections across the Pacific, and they're moving them through the interior of Peru. The album also features the interior spaces of the homes, particularly Aurelio Hacendados' home, in order to promote themselves not only as transnational merchants, but also as kind of settlers who are establishing families in Peru. And in particular, what he was a very big champion of was the establishment of local families, of intermixing. So he married a woman who was actually Peruvian. She's a Peruvian Creole elite. So he actually married into an upper class family. And he adopted her niece as his daughter. And then she married another Chinese immigrant. And so they created sort of this mixed race family, promoting the values of the era around mestizaje, and promoting the idea that Chinese were coming to localize, establish families, and stay, to combat the idea that they were foreigners. And in fact, a lot of these families, a lot of these people did not marry local women who were mestiza, who were Creole. This is uncommon. A lot of the merchants who came were actually part of a re-Sinicization of the Chinese community. Because the coolies, when they left the plantations, actually married sort of poor mestiza women, and they did couple with local women and have children and nest into the local communities. And when these merchants came, they actually then started to marry the daughters of those mixed marriages and introduced, again, Chinese practices, Chinese naming practices, and then Chinese lineage practices again. So it re-Sinicized the Peruvian Chinese community, making them seem like an exclusionary community. And so Aurelio Hacendados was actually sort of pushing against that within his own community to push back the idea that mestizaje has to be an important part of what we do here in order to become acceptable, to be seen as settlers. And finally, what is really important about these merchant elite, the ones who ran the big commercial firms, like 10, 12 of them were really big firms, and then they started to get smaller from there, but they were the 12 dozen or so really prominent guys all had plantations as well. So all the money they made from transnational commerce was also used to purchase or rent agricultural plantations, sugar and cotton plantations. So whereas before, the Chinese were the laborers on it and a highly exploited labor force, these guys transitioned to be employers of exploited laborers on these plantations. And what they're trying to feature here is we see sort of a new kind of logic coming in, where in the descriptions of these plantations, they talk about how they are innovators. They talk about how they're bringing industrialized practices into the plantation. So this is like a very modern sugar mill where they've introduced kind of like electricity into it. They rationalize production. They talk about how they also treat the workers, make sure that the workers are clean and sanitary and practice good hygiene, have good discipline. So they're disciplining the working population, which is oftentimes a mixed race population full of a lot of mestizos, which are people who are sort of mixed race people within Peru, and a lot of them with indigenous origins or mixed indigenous origins. And we see them also here. This is a Forsyth, who is an agricultural engineer from the United States, being employed on Aurelio Hacendados' plantation to show like the bringing in of modern engineering and management practices to maximize production and rationalize production on this plantation. And at the same time, we see sort of more kind of bucolic images of gardens. Here's one more where we really see sort of like this frontier kind of image of the countryside. This is also a very settler colonial logic to it because there are no indigenous people here. And what we see is really sort of like the landscape becomes a native wild habitat that is tamed and brought and made productive through the work of the Hacendados, the plantation owners, which in this case is Carlos Chimpanam, who is also Chinese from South China in Peru, another major figure of that community. And this is more images of his plantation and his family, and him roaming around with dogs and horses, as if, you know, he's on the frontier, like anything else that we're so familiar with. Now, back in South China, this is a really powerful imaginary. South Chinese, we have they have already their own imaginary about coming to the Americas called Gold Mountain. They call San Francisco, or the broader Americas, Gold Mountain. It's a place where you go to find gold, to get rich, and then to come back as a sort of successful immigrant who returns and is able to return. And we tend to think of it as sort of in relation to North America, where they didn't own plantations. But when we go back into sort of oral history accounts and some of the textual accounts, this is a collection of miscellaneous historical records that are compiled in Peru. It's it's like these miscellaneous compilations have been happening since the 1950s, and they stopped for a while during the Cultural Revolution, and now they're back again. But you can look through them. They're just little interviews with people, or the summaries of interviews with people a lot of times, and they tell people stories, and they're organized by locality or district or province. And when you go to the locality that you're studying, so this is from Guangzhou, the city of Canton, you can find history sometimes of immigrants who have come back, and then they're somehow interact with these researchers, and their stories get put in there. And so there are stories in there about former immigrants, returnees, who talk about one of the reasons they went to Peru is because they wanted land. And it was really hard in South China to get access to land. So land becomes a motivator for moving to Latin America in particular, and Peru specifically. Okay, so this is not just about imaginaries. This is also about the hidden realities beneath them. And that's about dispossession, right? The erasure of the indigenous person and the dispossession of land and labor. So to get at that, I look at a different set of records. I look at labor complaints from plantations. In the 1920s, the Peruvian government has established a labor bureau where people can go and a ministry of labor where people can go and report abuses of labor. And so all of these complaints start to pour in specifically from plantations, less so from industries and businesses and cities, and more from agricultural regions. And so we start to get to see that there are complaints also starting to pile up against Aurelio Hacendados, along with some other Chinese merchants and plantation owners. And so he owns two plantations, Hacienda Villa and Hacienda La Estrella. And he's being, denounced for laying people off, for contract violations, for replacing laid off workers with non-resident laborers, people who don't have communal land rights and working rights on plantations. So there's a whole mixture of labor arrangements on plantations in Peru. He's being accused of playing a part in demanding wage increases. People are demanding wage increases because of inflation. They're going on strike on his plantations. They want the reinstatement of laid off workers. So all these kinds of things are sort of troubling him. He's having antagonistic relationships with his employers on the plantations, but so are all the plantation owners, Chinese and non-Chinese. But the way in which we can see him sort of being part of the extension of these settler colonial logic is very visible in this last case from 1930, where a group of Yamacones, his family, are filed a complaint against him. And Yamacones are sort of like tenant farmers. It comes out of the old Inca system where indigenous people would leave their indigenous communal territories and communities,
and go and work for the Incas in a kind of tenant farming situation. And sort of this gets appropriated and modified by the Spanish Empire during the colonial periods, and it continues to survive. And so these folks are actually Yanacones, tenant farmers on Aurelio Hacendados plantation, Hacendados, and they come up with an idea that they propose that there's this area of unused land that's considered wasteland on the edges of the plantation, and they propose to bring it into production. They'll work, they'll improve it, they'll plant things and use their own money, and their own tools, and their own labor to make it productive. And for 2 years, they won't have to pay him or sell whatever they produce to Aurelio Hacendados. They'll keep everything because they're making the investment, they're taking the risk. And then after 2 years, when the land will be more productive, then they'll start to pay him or sell pay him rent or sell whatever it is that they produce to him at a cheaper rate. And he says, okay, no problem. And he lets them go on about working. And then about a year later, he comes to them and says, hey, could you sign this contract based on the terms that we had agreed to? And they say, okay, we'll sign the contract based on the terms they verbally agreed to. And then he lets them continue to work for another year. So the 2 years are up, the land is productive, it's been a successful venture. And then Aurelio Hacendados comes back a second time and says, hey, you guys owe me 2 years worth of rent. And these guys say, what are you talking about? We have a contract based on these terms we agreed to. They're like, yeah. He says, actually, it says you owe me rent. They were illiterate, so they did not understand that he had changed the terms of the contract. They did not look to see, they did not consult with anybody, they didn't think to. They thought that the verbal agreement was enough. And they said, this is unfair, these are not the terms that we agreed to. And he said, hey, actually, you didn't sign the contract with me. You signed a contract with Julio Sasaki, who's the Japanese foreman of my plantation. So you need to take it up with him. Now, how does a Japanese guy get on here? So the Japanese were brought in around 1900 because Japan was also trying to solve a population explosion problem, and they didn't have enough land to feed people. So they also started to look to North America, Canada, Latin America as a potential site where they could send immigrants to engage in settler colonial projects and work on land and then become successful, and then this would kind of boost sort of like the settler colonial expansion of the Japanese Empire and fix their problems. So they expanded to places like Manchuria, where they did engage in these kind of projects as imperial projects, but then they also orchestrated sending out populations in non-imperial projects by coordinating with national governments to send people out to the Americas. So they sent people out to Peru. So Julio Sasaki was one of the folks that got sent there. Probably was a worker on a plantation, didn't like the conditions, and found the conditions too difficult, and they often ran away. So he then probably hired himself out to Aurelio Hacendados, became an overseer of these plantations because they were very skilled agricultural workers, and started to oversee the plantation for him. And so Aurelio Hacendados exploited all of these sort of racial divisions within the workforce on his plantation to dispossess the Yanacones, these indigenous folks that were living and working on his plantation, of their labor, all the fruits of their labor, and access to the land. And he then had them sort of kicked off, tried to have them kicked off, and they filed their grievances. So beneath the surface, we can see larger processes at work. That is a moment when plantations are expanding their territories, intensifying agricultural production, rationalizing production, introducing sort of wage-labor relationships as well. And Aurelio Hacendados is just smart enough, like most plantation owners at the time, to exploit all of the fractions and divisions, especially racial ones, to benefit from those practices of dispossession. And we also see something else in the petition by the Yanacones, which is that they blame everything by saying, like basically, Chile se lo llevó todo, the Chinaman took everything. They don't say Aurelio Hacendados took it, they say the Chinaman. And working classes at this time were starting to be organized in through the labor movements using a very strong anti-Asian sentiment. And in 1930 in particular, there's a strong sort of backlash against the Asians because a political party emerges and comes to power shortly thereafter, which has fascist inspirations from Germany that uses anti-Asian sentiment to sort of consolidate support from the working classes, using sort of that racialized exclusion language to consolidate a mestizo population that does not sort of see itself as united, a mixed race, working class population. So here too, there is a trace of something else sinister coming in and coming back at Aurelio Hacendados, which is also a part of these racialized exclusions of settler colonial projects. Okay, so in conclusion, now why is it important to think about or think through these issues today where we are not, our development practices and the things that frame Chinese migrations to Latin America in the present moment, or the connections between China and Latin America today, are not organized in the same way. And I think we can take some lessons away from this. I'll give you two examples of what we can draw on here. The main thing is that thinking through settler colonialism teaches us to think about what Glenn Colcart, who is a scholar of settler colonialism in Canada in relation to Indigenous people, describes as the capital-land relationship. Settler colonialism is about sort of the coloniality of land and the dispossession of land. It's one of the fundamental things. And so when we think about China today in the world, and its bringing of new migrants, sort of its closer connections with Latin America, which is also leading way to new migrants coming in, and the reconfiguration of older migrant populations sort of are positioning themselves as sort of people who can easily mediate and broker these relationships and take advantage of them. We can also start to think about not the questions that often float around, which is China a new colonial power? Is China a new imperial power? Is China trying to dominate the world? But really, like, projects that are being activated in this moment, what is their relationship, that coloniality in their relationship? Do they have that? Because that tells us more about what's happening on the ground than these bigger questions that we still need to think about, but the more concrete questions are really about the realities on the ground. So let me give you two examples. The Morococha is a town up in Junín region in Peru, and there is a open pit mining project in this town. It's a town that was also occupied by a mestizo sort of an indigenous population that had been mining population in a mining town since the early 20th century. And Chinaco, which is also the aluminum corporation of China, is a state-owned enterprise. So it's a government, Chinese Communist Party organized, People's Republic of China organized entity, has taken over this mine and turned it into an open pit mine, which involves a lot of contamination of the groundwater and the environment, and has dispossessed the Morococha section of the Morococha community in order to expand this mine to open pit mining, and forcefully, or not forcefully, but through some coercion, relocated the population to a newly built town, which is kind of shoddy, and it's away from their normal cultural, social, commercial networks, and it has been resisted very fiercely by some members of the community who feel that this has been a very disastrous move for them. And there are people who are also organizing because there's high levels of contamination in the area. There's contamination of the water source, and they're trying to warn, or have been trying to warn, that this contamination will flow downstreams all the way down to Lima. So it's a very dangerous situation. So we see again this logic of dispossession. And then here, Paramonga and Barranca is, this is a picture of a sugar refinery on a sugar plantation that is run by the Wong family group. The Wong family group is a group of Peruvian Chinese family in Peru who started off in the early 20th century as a small grocer, and then the sons expanded the business in the 1980s and 90s to be the largest grocery store enterprise in all of Peru. And that, they sold this, I think it was 2015, and then sort of transitioned out of groceries into food production. And now they run this, this refinery And one of the problems, the challenges there is that for a long time, all you see all this soot, sort of smoke coming out of the chimney was dumping soot into the villages nearby. And so you can see pictures of villagers who were resisting taking pictures of like their children playing in sort of huge levels of soot on the playground. This was also kind of a dispossession again of like the natural environment as a healthy place for people to live. So it's these kinds of logics, this sort of coloniality of this mode of development that dates back to an earlier period, and that the Southern colonial moment was one of the ways in which that got expanded. That are the things that we need to pay attention to when we think about the relationship between China and Latin America or many other spaces of the world. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I know there's questions on, there's books online. So Maria, I don't know if you would like to moderate.
So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I've learned so much. And I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because I think, you know, there isn't enough done in terms of seeing the multiple migrations, diasporas that actually live and have histories in Latin America and how important those histories are, and especially, you know, considering the kinds of frames that we've been studying them under, so bringing the Southern colonial frame, I think to this has been really enlightening. So thank you so much. So we will just open it up for questions, whether it's you know, on the chat or, you know, if anybody has anything they would like to ask. Yeah.
So I was just, and I'm sorry if you covered this at the beginning, but your focus is on Peru, but as I think you alluded to, the Chinese presence in Latin America has been exploding since the early 1990s, and what comes to mind is that the new canal across the Canela, that they got Chinese investors. How pervasive do you see that in other countries with the Chinese investments?
I mean, I couldn't give you the statistics. I should. Maybe I'll come back when I write that chapter. It's sort of the concluding chapter of the book, but I haven't gotten to it. But it's significant all over Latin America. I think they're very prominent with investing in infrastructure projects. Both the People's Republic of China and Taiwan are sort of co-investors into the Panama Canal Zone. So it's not simply People's Republic of China. I was there visiting, and that was something that surprised me. And it's mainly because of this Trans-Pacific into the Trans-Atlantic shipping routes that they want to have control over. But they also have all kinds of infrastructure projects. There's one, I think, there's some that are in Panama to build railroads to cross. There had always been these projects that were co-present with the Panama Canal to try to build a railroad across so that they wouldn't be only dependent on the canal zone. So there's another project there. I don't know, there was a lot of resistance to it coming from, I think, the Colombia side, but I don't know exactly where it is these days. It's been a few years since I looked. But they build railroads, highways, they build industry, and they're involved in agribusiness tremendously and soy production in different countries. So they're heavily invested in Latin America.
It's more of a, can you just further discuss, you touched briefly in the presentation about how the Indian culture is kind of heavily related to the whole entire migration, but I just want to have a clarification on the connection to how does it relate back to the Cantonese community, Chinese people migrating and stuff like that. So can you just connect that?
Okay. Indigenous history of Peru. Okay. I'm by no means a historian of this, but sometimes we have to become strategic historians at times, so I'll try to do that. So a lot of the indigenous communities, their relationship to agriculture, and when the Europeans came, And then they started to take over the land. The Spanish actually recognized colonos, indigenous people as colonos with communal land rights. So that the areas where they lived, some of them where the plantations came and were established, were still given residence rights on those plantations, since they had already been there before, and they could work there. And even in this period that I'm talking about, there's still some, not all plantations have them, but some of them do. And so they get to, they have something, usually a kind of labor obligation. So they live, they have some autonomy, but they also have responsibilities and commitments. And then there are also people who are more like the folks we saw in that case of the complaint, that are of indigenous descent, but have been sort of out of that system for a long time. So they are tenant farmers, or they sell their labor to the plantations. They don't have the communal rights and obligations necessarily, but they are still sort of descendants of an earlier indigenous, community that have now become, maybe for quite a long time, have been sort of displaced from that and are just part of the laboring populations around. Yes.
I'm so sorry. I don't know how question.
No, I'm not answering your question, right?
You are answering my question, but I guess this question I'm about to ask goes like back into the clarification. So when you were describing, or when you were showing the images of the Indian coolies that migrated to different.
Oh, India.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Were you comparing it to the way how the Chinese migrated to different workforces and using the Indian diet graph with other things? I'm just really trying to understand where the Indian part came from, because I found out our reading is
Okay, so.
Yes, this part.
Okay, so it's basically, I use Indian, right, in two ways, right?
Okay.
The indigenous people of the Americas, who were, when Columbus discovered them, so to speak, were named Indians because they were trying to find a route to India. And they thought that they found it, but it was really Latin America. And they thought that the people in Latin America, the indigenous people, were Indians. So that's one population that's in Peru. Indians from India who go on the coolie labor trade do not go to Peru. So that's where I confused you.
Okay.
Yeah, they go to the Caribbean. So they're doing the same kind of work as the Chinese coolies on the plantations, but in the Caribbean. So they're in Jamaica, they're in Guyana, they're in Guadeloupe, Martinique, Trinidad, they're in Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. They're sort of in British colonies, but they're not in Latin America proper. Okay? Yeah, so I confused you, I'm really sorry.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't.
Yeah, so
I was just trying to. Okay, maybe.
they're two different, and then because the shipping routes don't go to Latin America, on the other side of Latin America where Peru is, they go to the Pacific and they get the Chinese instead. Okay?
So I think maybe just to help you understand a little bit more. So they're not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah.
But that these traders are similar. That coolie, slave or indentured labor trade from China is similar to the one where Indians were transferred to
those
Peru.
islands.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And it's a similar type of.
Yeah, so that's how I was just trying to understand this. It was a comparison.
Yeah.
Kind of to what you were discussing about. I just wanted to understand that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that this had nothing to do with what exactly we're talking about, because I'm just kidding.
Yeah. No, I know this is new history for a lot of people, so thank you for your question, because next time I can make it a little bit clearer for folks.
Yeah, and I think the connection between like using coolie because of the kind of same labor practices, which for me was new information, because I only understood it through this Caribbean
Caribbean thing, me too. Yeah, so I was like, this is really interesting.
Yeah, so understanding that those same labor practices were understood in Peru and through this migration as really because of the kind of labor and route, like sort of the logic of the routes is, opening up a whole new Thank you.
Understood. Okay, questions? I don't know if people online have questions?
No.
No, okay.
Does anybody else have any questions?
One more, any idea, theory of, despite the fact that we've got such a long-term Asian population in Peru and in many parts of Latin America, they really haven't entered the political field, right, other than Fujimori or?
A little bit. There's the newer generation of the last 10, 15 years have tried to, not as high as Fujimori, but other areas of government where they can play sort of like roles as advisors. So they're actually, the Hmong group folks actually run an association, the Asociación Peruana China, Peruvian Chinese Association, and they actually do a lot of work to like cultivate elites to strategically become brokers of transnational connections and to sort of insert themselves in sort of some positions of influence in government. And they also participate in organizing like biannual conferences on trade between China and Peru. So they're trying to, so we may see more positions, people in positions of governance appearing, but it's a project that they have. Yeah. Okay. All right. Of course.
It's not a question about the presentation, it's a question about yourself. What is your name? Can you remind me your name one more time?
Oh, my name is Anna Candela.
Thank you.
Thank you. What's your name?
Oh, my name is Adriana.
Adriana.
No, Daviana.
Daviana.
Yeah.
It's hard to hear these things.
Yeah.
Thank you, Daviana, for your questions, and all of you. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I just want to remind everybody that we do have our closing events next week on Thursday. It's a salsa workshop. We'd love to see you there. There's a flyer by the door, and thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you there.
Thank you for coming. It was very interesting.
Oh, that's good.
And I am not